Good afternoon, everyone. If I could get everyone to please return to a seat. And we had assigned tables for our noon luncheon, but feel free to sit anywhere you'd like this afternoon. We have an interesting speaker to kick off our afternoon session. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Brian Bohr, Dean of CFANS, to come up and introduce our special guest and our afternoon speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, and welcome everyone to our afternoon session. I'm delighted, as an economist myself, to introduce Neel Kashkari, who's the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank in the 9th District. I can almost end my presentation with, I think I'm introducing, as Dosecki said, the most interesting man in the world. If I run through his background very briefly, he originally started as a mechanical engineer and worked in essentially rocket science, working at NASA space missions when he came out of school. From there, he went on to serve in the U.S. Treasury Department, and during that time, he oversaw the Troubled Assets Relief Program, TARP, as we all knew it, and basically saved the Western world from financial collapse during that time. And for that, he was awarded the Alexander Hamilton Award, presaging, I guess, the Broadway play, for Treasury Department's highest honor of distinguished service. I should warn him that my name is often pronounced Burr, so with that Hamilton Award and Burr, you might have some challenges there. Following his tenure in Washington, President Kashkari returned to California in 2009 and joined PIMCO as managing director and manager of their executive office, and then explored returning to public service in 2014, running for governor of California on a platform that was focused on economic opportunity. So please join me in welcoming Neel Kashkari.
Thank you. That was great. Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you all for inviting me today. And Brian and I are going to have a Q&A session after some brief remarks that I give here. We're going to do a Q&A amongst the two of us, but then we're going to turn to all of you. You know, it's really important for me. So I'm the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, have been president since January of 2016. I always like to start by explaining why I'm here and what the Federal Reserve does. A lot of people don't understand. The Federal Reserve is our nation's central bank. So Congress created the Federal Reserve System in 1913, and our jobs are to try to manage some of the ups and downs of the U.S. economy to keep stable growth and maximum employment. And the reason why it's important that I'm here to hear from all of you is there's something unique about our nation's central bank. So if you go back in American history, Brian talked about Alexander Hamilton. He actually created the first central bank of the United States, called the Bank of the United States. It lasted about 20 years, and then Congress got rid of it. Then they created another central bank, and then they got rid of it. And then our economy, especially the ag economy, was hammered by banking crises in the late 1800s. And America basically always said, we don't like the idea of having a central bank because it sounds nefarious, a bunch of bankers in a dark room doing God knows what. We don't like that. But then when the U.S. economy was hammered with banking panics and crises, Congress said, well, I guess we need to have a central bank to manage these ups and downs. But if we're going to have a central bank, we're not going to keep it all in Washington, D.C., under the thumb of the government. We want to do something unique. So in 1913, Congress created what's called the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., and 12 independent regional Federal Reserve banks, including the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So they did that because they wanted all the regions of the country to be directly represented in economic and monetary policy making. So at the Minneapolis Fed, our jobs are literally to represent all of you. So our region includes Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and northwestern Wisconsin. So a big part of my job is to get out around our region and hear directly from constituents what's happening in your economy, what's happening in your businesses or on your farms. Are you able to find workers? What's happening to wages? What's happening to prices? So that I can take this information back with me when I go back to Washington, D.C. every 6 weeks when we set interest rates for the nation. So the reason I'm here, and I'm excited to be here, is because I'm here happy to tell you what we're working on at the Federal Reserve, but I'm really interested in hearing from you. What's happening in your markets, what's happening in the ag sector around our region, so that I can be more informed when I go back to Washington, D.C. And that's why when I give talks like this, I set aside most of the time for Q&A, so I can hear directly from you. You can ask me anything you'd like, but I'd also love to hear what you're seeing, what you're experiencing. And some of my colleagues from the Minneapolis Fed are here and have been attending the conference, hearing from the other speakers as well. So the one ask that I have for you is don't be shy. I always tell people, ask me your toughest question or give me your toughest comment, because that's how I'm going to learn the most. So don't be Minnesota nice. Just give it to me straight, and I'll be able to learn as much as I can from you. So some of the things that I know you've been talking about today, I know trade is a big topic of enormous concern to the ag sector. I'll just give you a few thoughts on it. I know Brian and I are going to talk about it, and we'll hear more from you. You know, I'm sympathetic overall with the need to be tough on China. I've observed, I was in Washington as part of the Bush administration and briefly under the Obama administration. My old boss, Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, had intensive engagement with China. One of the things that I've learned is that 20 years of having serious conversations with China, China smiles and nods, and then they do whatever they were going to do anyway. So 20 years of very serious conversations hasn't led to much. So we need to explore other ways of holding China account to actually have fair trade. So I'm sympathetic with the need to push China to open their markets and to have fair trade. I deeply believe that free trade has benefited the U.S. economy tremendously over our history. It's enormously important going forward. And there's real pain being felt right now, especially in the ag sector. But I'm also sympathetic with we do need to find a way to open markets around the world so that we have fair trade for U.S. producers and for U.S. consumers on a long-term basis. And so I'm sympathetic with that, though it's not a strategy without cost and without risks. Excuse me. Turning to monetary policy, which I'm sure many people here are going to have opinions about and interest in, the Federal Reserve has been raising rates for the past few years. I've been pretty outspoken saying I don't see the need to raise rates. So we have this thing called a dual mandate. One of our goals is stable prices. So inflation at 2%, that's how we define stable prices. Another goal is maximum employment, as many Americans who want to work are able to find jobs. And those two goals, stable prices and maximum employment, we traditionally think are linked through wages. So as the economy heats up and businesses have to compete to find workers, you typically think businesses now have to bid up wages, and then that leads to inflation. So as the job market gets tighter, you would think that that leads to higher inflation over time. Well, one thing that's really surprised us over the past few years, as the U.S. economy has gotten stronger and more Americans have come into the job market and the headline unemployment rate has fallen, now down to 3.7%, which is quite low historically, the big surprise for us, it hasn't led to much wage growth. Wages have picked up a little bit, but in the context of history, wage growth has not picked up very much, and it is not yet at a level that signals high inflation to come. So that means that there's been more slack in the labor market than we have appreciated. Traditionally, that headline unemployment rate was a pretty good measure of how much slack there is, and with the unemployment rate at 3.7%, you would think we must be at full employment. But that 3.7% number only includes people who are actively looking for work. If people gave up looking because of the Great Recession, they weren't counted in that number. So we've been pleasantly surprised when the U.S. economy has continued to create about 200,000 jobs a month, month after month after month, as more and more Americans enter the job market. So that's enormously positive for those workers. enormously positive for their families and for their communities. And the big question that we're wrestling with is, how many more are out there? Are there a lot more workers who would re-enter the job market if wage growth picked up? And so this is the debate that we continue to have at the Federal Reserve, and we don't know for sure. I mean, I wish we did know. I wish we knew exactly how much slack was left. We just don't know. And I've been in the camp saying, hey, let's take it easy on rate increases to allow the job market to continue to strengthen. And if we see signs of inflation picking up or inflation expectations picking up, we can always raise the rates then. And so far, I continue to think that that's an appropriate stance. But me and my colleagues are all focused on looking at the data, seeing how the economy actually evolves. So I'd be interested in hearing from you what you all are seeing. I know many farmers and many folks in the ag sector struggle to find workers. What are you doing? How are you responding? Are you, in fact, raising wages? You know, a lot of businesses that I meet with say, boy, it's so tough. We just can't find the workers we need. And then I say, well, have you tried raising wages? And often the answer is no. That's the last thing that they want to do. Increasingly, you do hear anecdotes of businesses saying, yeah, we are paying more now. And the good news is I often hear about it at lower-end workers, lower-skilled, entry-level workers. Their wages tended to have lagged in this recovery. It's nice that they're now starting to get some pay increases. But if you look at the aggregate wage data, the aggregate inflation data, we're not yet seeing signs of an economy that's overheating or inflation about to take off. But these are the signals that we're trying to figure out as we're determining the future path of monetary policy. So I talked a little bit about trade. I talked a little bit about monetary policy. What I think I'd like to do now is invite Brian to come out here. We're going to have a discussion, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. I think you can send in questions electronically, as well as we're going to have roving mics. So again, don't hold back. I'd love to hear directly from you. Both your comments and your questions are welcome. So why don't you come on out, Brian?
Thank you for those remarks, and I will emphasize, I'll put this, your ask for questions and input. As you all know, President Trump has been very active in giving the Fed recommendations. You have the same opportunity to do that today is the way I look at it. So I hope you'll take advantage of that and do raise questions. And as he said, you can both step to a microphone at any time. This is not meant, you'll get to listen to me less if you walk to the microphone. So do walk to the microphone, and then again, those tents that are on your table have the website that you can chime in on. But I will take the license of sitting here. And my first question, you talked about trade. And as I was listening about trade, I was thinking one of the elements that hasn't come up yet is foreign direct investment. And it just happens this morning that, of course, one of our local firms has been purchased by a South Korean company. If we look at our meat processing, meat packing sectors, we look at many of our grain sectors and so on, a lot of foreign direct investment is coming into the U.S. You know, how should we view that in agriculture? I mean, somebody this morning talked about money flows. Jason Henderson, I think, was talking about how money is flowing from the rest of the world into the U.S. as a safe haven. So how do you reflect on that? That's been a significant trend here. And what does that mean for agriculture, do you think, and really for the state's economy as well?
Well, I think foreign direct investment, again, it's enormously positive for the U.S. economy as a whole. The fact that investors around the world want to invest in America is a vote of confidence in our economy. And as imperfect as our democratic process is, it's also a vote of confidence in our overall democratic process and the rule of law. And that's why you always hear about the dollar as the reserve currency. It's because it's backed by the U.S. economy, and investors are saying we have confidence in the U.S. economy. So that's enormously positive, and we need to keep that. You know, people have asked me, well, when do we think there would be a competitor to the dollar, a credible competitor to the dollar? The two obvious candidates, the two other major economies in the world that would be obvious candidates, one would be Europe and the Eurozone. Obviously, if you're paying attention to the paper, they've got their own challenges, big challenges to sort out. And of course, China over time being a very large growing economy. But relative to Europe and China today, investors are saying, hey, we believe in the U.S. economy, and as imperfect as the U.S. political system is, we believe in that. So I think that's enormously positive, and I hope that our own competitive position stays ahead of the rest of the world going forward.
Yeah, and it actually ties in to wages as well. So there's been this long-running story that we were shipping manufacturing offshore, going to other countries because wages were lower. Now, to what extent is our economy from, part of its technology substituting for labor? What's happening with that dynamic between innovation? You mentioned a little bit with China and their policies. You got an innovation component, you've got relative wages, you've got labor that shift those global dynamics. What are you seeing there?
Well, one of the big questions that we are all wrestling with is it seems like there's tremendous technology that's being developed in our economy and in the global economy. Yet if you look at the productivity measurements, it's not showing up in the productivity measurements. So there are a lot of different theories for why that might be. Some people say the stuff that we're inventing right now, say Twitter, no offense to everybody on Twitter, and Facebook, they're basically leisure devices. They're not actually making us more productive. That's one idea. Another idea is that there is big innovation taking place, but it takes decades for it to work its way into the economy and really show up in productivity measurements. I know the ag sector is enormously innovative. And whether it's one of the reasons that prices are low is because farmers are so productive and are continuously setting new records for how productive they become. So I think these are complex questions. Productivity tends to be a global phenomenon. So if we invent a great new technology in Minnesota, it can quickly be adopted around the world, and then the world's productivity tends to improve. So this is something that we're seeing all around the world, and it's still something we don't completely understand.
So agriculture is kind of unique in that space, I think, because obviously the land that we have in this area of the world, in fact, Minnesota, one of the unique things, we're on about the 46th parallel of the globe, and about 50% of the world's agricultural production occurs on that same parallel. But there are other places in the world, Brazil, Argentina, that as we shift some of these trade policies, what are the influences, do you think, long-term? The question, long-term, we're changing the trade bargain, I guess, or deals. Have you given thought to how that shifts some of those dynamics in the world? Because, some of these agreements have been in place for, post-World War II, and we're making some pretty big shifts. Do you see big changes occurring, or is it more margin around the edges and the most competitive space wins no matter what?
My sense is, and you all are the experts in this better than I am, so let me just start there. My sense on these type of markets is, in the long term, it ends up being who's most competitive. I think in the short run, there are going to be ups and downs, and there are going to be shifts in the trade patterns. But if the U.S. farmers and Minnesota farmers and ag producers are more competitive, they're going to win the market share. And that's that's the nature of commodity markets that we are operating in. Now, ag is more complicated. It's not a pure commodity. It's not exactly steel. It's not exactly oil. I understand that. But at the end of the day, why has the U.S. been the leader in agriculture around the world for so long? Because we've been the most productive. And I don't see any evidence that that's changing. I don't think our innovation edge is going to go away because of these tariffs.
Yeah. So there's some good news in these trade. There's a solid basis. There's the short term. Let's look to the long term and how we improve those. Yeah. And march forward with that technology.
And you think about a parallel sector in the oil sector. So obviously oil prices are very volatile. When oil prices fell dramatically, it really affected North Dakota, as an example. But we didn't forget how to innovate. It absolutely affected the people who were doing the work. It absolutely affected those businesses. But our brain power that developed this technology didn't all of a sudden go away and stop thinking and stop innovating. Right. We continue to lead the world in that technology development. Right.
So good. I was talking far too much. So this is an interesting question too. So we mentioned President Trump, and I suspect
you mentioned.
Okay. I suspect this may be a question that you might not want to answer, but to what extent have President Trump's comments on low interest rates factored into Fed's decision making?
I can tell you honestly, not at all. One of the things that's wonderful about the Federal Reserve System, and I wish you all could peer behind the curtain. That's why I come out to do these type of town halls, to let you see in as much as you can. The Federal Reserve as an institution is non-political, non-partisan. It's really people who are dedicated to serving the country and achieving the goals that Congress has given us in a non-political manner. So starting with our chairman, Jay Powell, and all of the presidents and the governors of the Federal Reserve System, everybody is committed to making decisions based on data and analysis, not based on political consideration. So my colleagues and I we may look at the data and draw somewhat different conclusions. That's healthy, but we're all doing it for the right reasons, which is let's make the best decisions we can based on the data.
Well, the follow-up to that, I think, which is probably informative for people, what are the consequences of, we do have an independent Fed. You do make decisions based on the science of economics. Some people laugh about the science of economics, right? So what is the consequence of that influence creeping in there? What are the potentials of that? We read about it a lot, but what's your thoughts on that?
I think if we had a different composition of people around the Federal Reserve System, who were more focused on politics. Then I think that if you look at other countries where the executive branch or the legislature is able to exert direct influence on monetary policy decision making, what ends up happening is people lose confidence in the currency. They lose confidence in the funding of the government, the treasury bonds that are out there, and that expresses itself in inflation taking off. And you can see it in other countries around the world where that's happened. Well, if you look at U.S. inflation expectations, they are rock solid anchored. You know, the U.S. Treasury is printing out record debt levels. And yet the Treasury bonds, let's say a 10-year Treasury, right now is yielding around 3.15 or 3.2%, somewhere in that range. So Treasury rates are still very low. Why are Treasury rates so low? Because people have confidence. In part, they're low because people have confidence that the Federal Reserve is independent and is going to make decisions based on data, not based on politics. And so if that were to be compromised, and I don't think it will be, if that were to be compromised, it would show up in higher inflation expectations and higher government borrowing costs.
Right. So the full faith and credit of the U.S. dollar is at stake, essentially. Yeah. This goes a little bit back to the productivity question you had. You know, will the rest of the world close the gap? We may be seeing some of that already. You look at some of the investments that China has made in their own agricultural systems, dramatic changes over the last 10 to 15 years. So what are your thoughts on the global gap that we've had historically? Is that closing?
Well, we always see in all types of different innovation markets, you see laggards who are able to adopt fairly new technology and close a lot of the gap. So they can demonstrate remarkable productivity because they're just catching up to where we are. So that's going to happen, and that's actually a good thing. The world economy is becoming more productive as people who are using, technology multiple generations ago start adopting modern practices. That's good for the global economy as a whole. But at the end of the day, who's going to be on the cutting edge? Yeah. On whether it's ag or it's software or it's hardware or it's energy, I don't see anybody who's remotely positioned to out-innovate the United States of America. I've seen no evidence of that. And so we need to keep investing in our universities. We need to keep investing in research and development. But I think we are best positioned to continue to lead that in that competition.
Right. In productivity, technology came up, and you just mentioned it. Occurred to me, we were talking about wages earlier. So one of the challenges in agriculture, while we have been tremendously technologically advancing, and of course one of the issues is we see people then leave agriculture to move into other sectors of the economy. And we're in an interesting place now, and I think in agriculture you've probably seen the autonomous tractors, for example, and some of the automation robotics, and this hasn't come up today yet, I don't think, in this conversation. So you've got this a bit of in agriculture now, and necessity is the mother of invention. So that we've got the technology advancements. We have kind of a labor crunch we hear about here. Where do you see, will robots take over agriculture? Where does that dynamic fit between wages, technology innovation in ag? What's your sense of, and that's across the economy, really. That's not just agriculture.
Yeah, it's across the economy. So one of the other explanations for why productivity growth has been low in recent years, and we don't know how much of this is true, is when the Great Recession hit and unemployment in the nation spiked to 10%, there was a lot of labor available. So businesses could say, you know what, I don't need to invest in this new machine. I can just go hire a few more people to do the job. And now as labor gets tighter and more scarce, businesses, including ag, are saying, you know what, it's harder for me to find workers. Maybe I will go invest in that technology. So I think that this trade-off between technology and labor has been happening forever. I mean, certainly if you go back 100 years or 150 years ago, when ag was incredibly labor intensive, and then automation came back then, and people said, well, that's the end of labor. What's going to happen to all these workers? Well, they moved into factories, they moved into cities, and they did different jobs. So I think that this dynamism of the global economy and the U.S. economy has been with us for a long time, and I think it's going to be with us for a long time. I don't think it predicts the end of labor. I think the nature of jobs is changing.
Yeah. So yes, does anybody out there have, I want to ask this question, what are you seeing as you're facing, we hear, and I guess I could almost turn it into the, between immigration questions. Minnesota, if you look at rural communities in Minnesota, particularly the Wilmers, the major centers, Marshalls, and you look at population demographics, you'll see a fairly significant, there's more diversity in those communities in terms of origin. So a lot of from Latin America, of course, other parts of the world, from Eastern Europe to Africa, in work there. That's really changing the face of rural communities as well. And I'm curious for people in the audience, what do you see happening with quality of labor availability in some of these regions where we do have significant manufacturing, processing investments there? And what are people doing to address that? Are you investing in new technologies? Are you making those types of decisions now? I think that's the kind of thing you were asking people to respond to. But in the meantime, your sense of, there's the immigration question in that a little bit.
Sure.
A little bit of rural communities and what impact labor has on them.
Well, when I travel around our region, as you all know, our region is very rural. And most rural communities I go to, people say, we're really worried about the future of our communities because our young people are leaving. Our young people go away to college and maybe they stay and they don't come back. And what's going to happen to our towns? And there are a handful of towns that have really turned to immigration to try to change the dynamics, the growth dynamics. And so I've been going around. In fact, we had a conference earlier this week at the Minneapolis Fed on immigration's role in our regional economy, both to meet the needs of the workforce, so businesses and farmers who need workers, and if you think about what happens to the future of many of these towns that are declining population, immigration has a very important role to play. I mean, this is math. So I'm going to leave it to all of you to decide on whether you like immigration or not, but I'm just going to do the math for you. One important source of economic growth is simply population growth. And we all are having fewer kids than we had 30 years ago or 50 years ago. So your choices are, you can accept slower growth, you can try to subsidize fertility, and usually people laugh when I say it, but Japan is trying. You can give tax credits and child care to encourage families to have more kids. By the way, it takes 20 years to grow a new worker. Just want to point that out. Or number three, you can embrace immigration. And that's math. And so we as a country need to recognize the reality of that math and whether or not we want strong growth over the long term. I'll tell you, 3% GDP growth, long term, 3% GDP growth is very hard to deliver unless we do something about our demographics. You can do it in the short run with fiscal stimulus. We know how to do that. But you can't do it over a decade, year on year, if you don't do something about our demographics. And that's math.
Great. Well, I take it we do have some notes on here, but we must have a bunch of millennials in the audience. They won't step up and go to the mic. But I'll ask the question. This follow on to this. It looks like in rural Minnesota, not convinced higher wages will convince urban workers to come out to greater Minnesota. Do we need to have some sort of a reverse move from the traditional view in agriculture? Was you do bring kids from the farm. I myself am one of those farm into a city somewhere. Are there some things we should think about with regard to how do we start to, it could be, the amenities of rural communities, roads, transportation, internet access. Yeah. What are the kinds of things we might do to start to convince people that rural areas are a great place to live?
Well, I am seeing some towns who are much more aggressive on this front. So some small communities are actively saying we want to improve the amenities so that when our young people leave, they want to come back when it's time to start a family. And you do see people doing the round trip, successfully. So there needs to be amenities is one. There need to be jobs for them to be able to use the skills that they've gained in whatever their job or their profession is. Things like internet access. I mean, they seem simple, but they're not simple for a lot of rural communities to be able to deliver on these things. So there are things that some communities are doing a better job of and having some success. But at the end of the day, I think the most powerful signal is wages. Yeah. It's funny, wherever I go, people tell me, oh my gosh, we have a welder shortage. We just cannot find enough skilled welders. So when I go to community colleges, and I visit a bunch of them around our region, I get a tour of the college, and I'll take the president of the community college, and I'll say, hey, you need to train more welders. What's the matter with you? And they've said to me, a few college presidents have said, we've tried. We expanded our welding program, we hired more teachers, we built more labs, and we got no more students. And that tells me there's not a welder shortage. The wages for welders need to go up. And if the wages for welders go up, guess what? People will say, hey, that's a good career. I'm going to go into that. I'm going to go get trained, and I'm going to be a welder. So if, as farmers become increasingly technology savvy, my guess is, some of the hand labor is going to continue to disappear, and you're going to need people with higher and higher skills. Fewer people, but higher and higher skills. And as those wages go up, you're going to be able to attract people to come to take them.
That's a great point. Leads to wages and inflation conversation you had earlier.
Yeah, potentially, but productivity is the medium, so to speak, right?
Great. So, a question here about: do you have an ag advisory committee at the Fed? Just a pretty straightforward question.
We have different advisory committees, some of whom are made up of ag lenders, some of whom are directly representing the ag community. So we have different mediums of getting feedback to us. We also have regional economists. One of our economists, Joe Mann, is here today, who focuses on the ag sector. And then, so he's out and about. And then when I travel around our region, I actively make sure that I'm meeting with people from the ag community to hear directly what's happening. This is a huge region. Montana, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, et cetera. There's no one ag sector in that region, right? There are huge regional differences. There are weather differences within that region, in addition to different commodities that we're actually producing.
Yeah. Some would say in January the weather conditions are pretty similar, but certain times of year.
But some places in our district, it's drought. In other places, it's too much rain. And this is in one Federal Reserve district.
So I like this question about steel. So it goes a little bit to trade again. We're seeing steel and aluminum come in agriculture, whether it's manufacturing or farm equipment, you name it. A lot of steel and aluminum goes into agriculture.
Yes.
What's your sense of that in terms of where that's heading to and what impact it might have on ag, and what does it do for manufacturing? We have a heavy manufacturing base here in Minnesota.
Yeah, no, manufacturing. One of the things that's really great about our Minnesota economy and our regional economy is that it's very diverse. Most major sectors of the U.S. economy are represented here. And that's really a source of strength, because if ag is suffering, there's a chance the other sectors are doing better and they can balance each other. But you're right, we do have a lot of manufacturing here, and we are exposed to that. So this is where I think the best hope for all of us is that there can be some resolution to these trade battles that are taking place right now, that soon. I don't think this uncertainty or elevated tariffs is going to serve us well over the long term. We need to get to a fair trade, and we need to get to trade certainty as soon as we possibly can. The longer this goes on, it is going to be painful for the ag sector and for the other sectors that are directly exposed to it.
Just to follow that, we mentioned getting to get to a fair trade. What's your sense of China's strategy in this right now? So the U.S. kind of fired the first volley in a way. What do you think their strategy? Do they recognize some of these? Obviously, it seems, or people have at least claimed that part of the strategy was to hit agriculture a little bit with some of their trade. Do you see that continuing on, the retaliatory? That's the classic trade war phenomenon, or?
It seems like it. Now, the big question is, so China's economy, we know that China's economy is much more trade dependent than is our economy. I know for folks in the room, trade is enormously important, and it is to the U.S., but as a share of our economy, trade is a much smaller share of the U.S. economy than it is for China. So that would imply that dollar for dollar or renminbi for renminbi, they have a little bit more to lose in the short run than we do, a little more risk. So then the question is the political dynamics, which is, does China and they're not a democracy. So can they endure pain? Can their political system endure pain longer than our political system can endure pain? And that I don't know. So far, if you look at the national statistics for the U.S. economy, the tariffs are having almost no effect. They're having an effect on farmers, they're having an effect on the ag sector. But if you add up all the sectors of the U.S. economy, the tariffs are not really showing up in any meaningful way yet. We think they are showing up for China. So it does seem like China is feeling more pain right now. But it might be that their political system allows them to have a higher pain tolerance for longer than we have. And I don't know how that's going to play out.
Yeah. That's really interesting. There's a couple of people here, of course, interest you get plenty of questions about. And all of them are long range looking at interest rates. One looking back to the 70s and 80s and what that did to land values. One asking about what the next 3 to 5 years are. I think Howard Buffett wrote a book called 40 Years, and the notion of that was most farmers have 40 years of their investment and work in this. I think, Chris, you said 32 years, so she's getting close to 40 years. So what are the longer term, what do you see happening with interest rates? And the Fed's kind of walking this line, wage inflation, where does that move and over the longer run? And what does that mean for land values?
Well, over the last 30 years or so, one thing that we've seen is that interest rates in advanced economies have gradually declined. So interest rates now, the notion of what interest rate is neutral, what interest rate neither stimulates the economy nor taps the brakes. I think we're pretty close to neutral today, and that's a lot lower than where neutral was 20 or 30 years ago. So what determines that? Well, what we think determines that are things like productivity growth, things like demographics, some of these broader macroeconomic forces wrapped together in determining the overall supply and demand of capital. And that ultimately determines where neutral is. So right now, it's very hard to say where interest rates going to be in 30 or 40 years. I basically have no idea because I don't really know what's going to be happening to productivity. If there's great new inventions that require a lot of capital and that are very productive, you could imagine huge demand for capital all around the world, but it's going to be very productive to make those investments, and the neutral interest rate will be higher than it is today. So these are the broad macro forces that affect us, but that we don't really have direct influence over. So over the next few years, the outlook for inflation is contained. The U.S. economy looks strong. I feel more confident in that. What's going to happen 20 years from now or 30 years from now, boy, we just don't know.
It's interesting in this conversation 10 years ago, we were talking about deflationary. When you were managing TARP,
Yep.
That was the concern. We have not done a whole lot to reduce sovereign debt around the world, and a couple of people have asked this question in here. That's why I'm raising it now, I guess. What do you see as the risk size? So in the U.S., in fact, I guess the estimate, if I recall right, is about $1 trillion from the tax relief program.
Or 1.8, something like that.
Yeah. What do you see as the risk of? There was an earlier slide today about housing markets and where they're at relative to wage increases, for example. What is the risk of debt out there? What does that do to inflation, deflation, that tipping point?
Well, you would expect, so we know no country can afford to print debt forever. You can't live beyond your means. At some point, investors around the world say, you know what, I'm losing confidence in your economy, that you're going to pay this debt back, and there's someplace else I want to go invest in. So it's somewhat of a relative game. So you could imagine if Europe gets their political house in order, and now investors around the world say, you know what, I'm going to go invest in Europe as a better place to invest in America. Then all of a sudden, our debt capacity relatively gets reduced. Now, the question is, we don't know when that's going to happen. We don't know, are we 5 years away from that happening or 20 years away? We don't know. Right now, if you look at the data, investors around the world are saying we have a lot of confidence in the U.S. economy and the U.S. economic system, including our legal system and our political system, and we feel good about that. But at what point is that going to change? And again, it's partly a relative measure. It's not just up to us. It's also up to other countries when they make their economies relatively more attractive places to invest. So that's why it is important that we make tough choices to live within our means, to get our fiscal house in order while we still have time. We certainly don't want to be in a position of being forced to do it because investors have already decided, hey, we've lost confidence in America, we're going to go invest in Europe, or we're going to go invest in China. That's going to be a much more painful adjustment for us to make than to make it when we are the more attractive economy.
Good. So somebody's got my interest at heart here, it looks like, with the question about education. And I'm going to broaden out from here. Let's talk about higher education. But as you look at the U.S. economy in general and rural economies, historically one of the great differentiators for the U.S. has been a really strong, both from all the way from K-12, we have some FFA students here today, all the way from K-12 on through higher education. And now we have these elements of what's the cost of higher education. Are we investing sufficiently in all education? And what we're observing within that, so this is a multi-part question, I can't stand to ask just one question. Okay. There's sort of these achievement gaps that we hear a lot about. And if you look at classroom availability, the distance to get to your schools in rural communities where you have what do we do about education? What are some of the issues you see there going forward? And your thoughts on what we can do to maybe influence that.
Yeah. It's enormously important. So you're exactly right that one of our competitive edges, our advantages in the past century was that our population was by and large far more educated than competitive nations around the world. And the rest of the world, frankly, is catching up. Now, you can't do it forever, right? You can't just continuously provide 5 or 10 years more education to all of your population in an arms race, because eventually people got to work, right? You can't be in school forever. So it's a good thing in some sense that other nations are also investing in education, but our source of advantage is also diminishing. And there are these huge gaps that you just talked about, which are a huge problem for us. So at the Minneapolis Fed, we've launched a major new research institute focused on understanding why these gaps exist, why they're so persistent, and what we can do to close it. So I wish I had a silver bullet, an answer, but we know we have to be able to provide a high quality education to all of our young people. We have to give all of our young people in rural Minnesota, in the cities, high quality education, great access, and open doors for them. Education is the great equalizer. You know, I feel like I am proof of what is possible in our country if you get a good education. My parents came here from India. We were middle class, but I had a big advantage because my parents were highly educated. They insisted that I got a good education. Because I got a good education, every door has been open to me. So we got to provide that to all of our young people in Minnesota in and around our country. And that means things like technology. There's a lot of innovation happening in online learning. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to replace all classrooms, but it is showing promise. And our access to affordability to higher education is also critical. It cannot simply be that we force every student to take on more and more debt. That is not a solution. It is at best a Band-Aid. It's not a long-term viable strategy.
You know, to kind of jump a little bit here, we haven't talked about exchange rates. You kind of stepped around those a little bit. This question is more about what about countries who don't have Federal Reserve banks? And if I'm not mistaken, I think we're seeing a little bit of some Brazil right now, some flaky monetary policy perhaps going on, put it that way. What does that do to our competitive realm? I mean, I'll even take this to the point where at one point there was talk about not having the U.S. being the currency, the global currency. So what do you see happening there?
Well, this goes back to the notion of people having confidence in the U.S. economy, confidence in the dollar, confidence in our economic system, and confidence, frankly, that the Federal Reserve is going to make decisions based on economic reasons, not based on political reasons. And so there are many examples around the world where politicians find it very attractive in the short term to tell their central banks, hey, you keep rates low because it's going to be good for the economy in the short run. And the central bank acquiesces, and then that is good for the economy in the short run, but then that leads to an overstimulating of the economy, which leads to inflation, and then people lose confidence in the economy. So it's a short-term win, but long-term it actually puts the economy at a big-time disadvantage. And so obviously we have to avoid that, and that's why I think the Federal Reserve is well-positioned to keep doing our jobs, because everyone across the Federal Reserve System is committed to making decisions based on economic data, not based on political considerations.
So I'm going off the screen so you jump a little bit for you. Hope you've seen how quickly you can change your mindset here.
Okay.
But a lot of conversation about technology. One of the issues that's coming in here now is the sustainability question, sustainability and stewardship, and the role that technology plays in that, but also the treadmill. It's almost that classic technology treadmill case. There's so much, this has a bit of a tone to it of, there's a lot of push and a lot of need to keep on that treadmill, keep moving and advancing forward with technology innovation and stewardship all at the same time. Does that ever stop? Is that sort of the nature of the global world we're in with these technologies, or are there ways to, enable people to think more broadly about how do we think about, not that they're mutually exclusive, but where does that fit together? Because a lot is the ecosystem values I think they're getting to with services in land, and what is that?
I think it's always going to be a challenge to find the right balance. It's always going to be a struggle, both as individuals. How much do we let technology, run our daily lives? How much do we get absorbed by social media, as an example? But also in our businesses. And how much are you going to invest in technology and the latest thing versus focusing on sustainability? And hopefully, technology can enable sustainability and make us more effective in achieving high productivity, high output, but also in a sustainable manner. That's the right balance that I think we all aim to strive for.
So we've talked a lot about changes in ag. I know one of the issues, and we've talked a lot about labor here, and I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet, but what about healthcare in this region? In fact, just a couple days ago, I think we saw Mayo got a $200 million investment there. We hear a lot about, we have the best medical care in the world if you can afford it, kind of things. Rural communities, of course, access to physicians. We're seeing shortages of physicians, dentists, you name it, across health professions. Does the Fed have a role in engaging that conversation? And how do we start to solve? That was obviously a big part of the campaign, was around healthcare. What are your thoughts on both big picture and I think really focused on rural communities and farmers, who a lot of healthcare comes through? If you're at a large company, I'm at the University of Minnesota, we have healthcare programs. If you're an individual, that market's quite different.
Yep.
Address some of those questions.
Well, these are big, complicated questions that there are no simple answers for. We had a Harvard professor at the Minneapolis Fed visiting us a month or so ago, presenting on this very point. And he noted, it's very interesting, he said that Minnesota has some of the best health outcomes at the lowest cost relative to some other states that spend, I think he said it compared Minnesota to Florida, they spend 2x per capita for similar health outcomes. So Minnesota actually, if you look at the data, has a lot going for us. But again, it's not available to everybody, but we're doing better than some other places around the country. So one thing that I noticed, I was visiting South Dakota, and I can't remember if it was Sioux Falls, but they had a big telemedicine presence where they have teams of doctors that I visited, and they beam their doctors, their specialists, into rural communities around the country. So their model that they were adopting was a rural community might have a general practitioner or a nurse practitioner, and then if they needed a specialist, they would go by video to the specialist in South Dakota who would walk the nurse practitioner or the general practitioner through how to treat this patient, and then determine, hey, do we need to send this patient to a major medical center, or can we do this remotely? That was one example of technology trying to help close some of these gaps that we know are there and are real and are serious. So again, I don't think we have an easy answer for this. I think it's going to continue to be a challenge, but it is promising that technology might have a role to play in closing some of these gaps.
I'd like to have you see it have a lot more ansers here. No, but it is complicated questions.
Professor, I could turn to you too.
Heal thyself. I hear that in the healthcare question, right? So there's a question about the economy, and we talk about monetary. In fact, you're here, so we're going to talk monetary. But actually, I'm going to widen that out for a little bit. And
okay.
It's actually, I never thought of it before, but a little bit of a rebuttal to, we've got fiscal, we've got monetary. We've got the federal government passing budgets and what they do with tax policy and so on. This question is about moving beyond the 2% growth mark for the growth of the economy. Monetary policy is part of that. Be interested in your comments about, it's almost a reverse order of that. What's happening, do you think, with tax policies, and how are those affecting growth, and what's the potential there? And that ties, I suppose, a little bit to the debt question too. But
yeah,
can we increase growth?
It's really too soon to know what the effect is on the tax cut from last year. And so there's two schools of thought that I'll lay out for you. One school of thought says this is just a sugar high. That, if you spend more, you're going to get more GDP growth in the short run, but eventually that extra spending wears off and you return back to your prior growth rate. That's one school of thought, that the tax cut is not going to lead to higher long-term growth. The other school of thought is, well, maybe it's going to lead to a lot more investment, and that investment is going to lead to more productivity, and that's going to improve the long-term growth rate of the U.S. economy. From my perspective, I think the jury is still out. We just don't know yet. I meet with a lot of businesses, and I ask them, have you increased your investment because of the tax cut? So far, you're seeing some uptick in investment in the early part of this year. It seems to have dropped off in the third quarter. Is it going to pick back up again? I don't know. You are seeing a lot of companies that are buying back their stock. Well, that's not a signal of increasing investment. That's a signal of returning capital to shareholders. So I think the jury is still out. But we know that long-term, let me just go back to the fundamental principles. Where does long-term economic growth come from? It comes from increasing labor, so more workers to produce things and more consumers to buy things, and it comes from productivity growth. It does not come from increased budgets, deficits forever, because you can't do it forever, and it does not come from monetary policy. It comes from more productivity and more workers. And we know we have fewer workers going forward just because our fertility rates are down. So we need to do something about that. And somehow we need to keep productivity up.
There's a little question on that about, can we continue that productivity treadmill for, what's that cycle? But I'll move to the next one, I think. Underlying concerns about the Chinese economy, we broaden that out to the global economy because we are seeing some weakness in other places. What's your projection around the rest of the world and their ability to lift the overall?
I'll tell you, the global economy is, as hard as the U.S. economy is to predict, predicting the global economy is also very, very difficult. And so I think we're somewhat surprised that the global economy seems to be slowing right now. Is it just a temporary headwind or is it something longer term? We don't know. We do know that U.S. monetary policy does have an effect on the world. So when we tend to raise rates, emerging markets often can be somewhat exposed to the U.S. economy raising rates. So when we set U.S. monetary policy, we try to set the optimal policy for America. We're not setting it for the world. But we do pay attention to what's happening around the world as a feedback loop back on the U.S. economy. So we do care what happens to the world because it can affect the U.S. economy. So right now, the U.S. economy seems to be the strongest engine of the major economies around the world. Is that going to last, especially if the Fed keeps raising rates? It's hard to know.
Yeah. So is there any coming up and going to be executed on? We're seeing other countries moving beyond that sort of, since we just, recognized the close of World War I, a 100-year anniversary of that. What do you see happening with that? Some of it's part of the trade dynamic that countries are choosing to somewhat, break away from those long-term trade agreements. How do you see that playing out in the global economy? That's a real shift over the last 40 years from where things had been.
Well, Europe is related but different a little bit to the trade discussion in the sense. So Europe, when they adopted the common currency, they said we're going to have one monetary policy for the Eurozone that's set by the European Central Bank, but they didn't harmonize the rest of the country, the rest of the economies. So in the US, we have one monetary policy. We have $1. You can live anywhere you want in the US. There's free flow of trade between the states, free flow of services. It truly is a national economy. Well, we have one fiscal government, right? The US government taxes all of us, and then they issue bonds on behalf of all of us, and then they spend on behalf of all of us. Well, Europe hasn't gone that far yet. Europe has the common currency, but they have not yet harmonized all of their different fiscal situations across the various states. So that's created tensions between, let's say, Germany and Italy, or Germany and Greece, et cetera. So that's a fundamental tension that they need to find a way to reconcile in the Eurozone. And these things can take time, right? As I mentioned at the start, Alexander Hamilton created the first bank in the United States. It lasted about 20 years. Then they created another one. Then Andrew Jackson killed that one off. And then in 1907, there was a banking panic, and Congress responded by creating the Federal Reserve in 1913. The reason I'm giving you that history is some of these democratic processes take a long time to sort out. And is Europe going to take 5 years or 20 years or longer to sort all this out? I don't know.
So we're getting near the end of our time, and I would like to hear, what do you see, what would you like to tell the President of the Federal Reserve Bank that you think they should be focusing on or that we haven't talked about? Looks like there's a question back to the right.
Yeah, it might not be related to, if you wanted to go someplace else, go ahead. I'm not sure. I had a question related back to earlier conversations. And both of you might have a perspective on this, but we had a conversation this morning about intellectual property. And Neel, you've mentioned a number of times about how the rest of the world benefits from our innovation. So how important is it for there to be a return to innovation in terms of, intellectual property that's developed, and gets stolen by other countries and used against us in some way for competition? The earliest, if my 55-year-old mind can remember what I learned 40 years ago, the earliest Example that I can think of is Eli Whitney's carrying the designs for a cotton gin across the Atlantic, and using that to great advantage for the U.S., right? So China does a lot of things like that to us. Is that important that we stop that stealing of intellectual capital, or is that insignificant in terms of our ability to continue to be innovative leaders?
I mean, I think it's enormously important. At the end of the day, you all invest in your businesses to get a return. And I think it's enormously important that the U.S. find a way to enforce our intellectual property protections in markets around the world. Now, the optimists will say China is investing a lot of money in their education system and in R&D, and that when they start developing technologies of their own, it's going to be in their own interest to protect them. So they're going to have to develop intellectual property protections for their own innovations, which will then benefit us and our innovations. Now, I hope that's true, but at the baseline, it is enormously important. And I think the fundamental political conflict that we're having with China around trade, more than anything else, is about intellectual property protection and the ability to access their markets while still protecting our innovation. So my opinion is it's enormously important.
He asked me to add to that.
Please.
So it's a really interesting dynamic question, because that's from the producer side of the equation, right? That you protect that IP, you spur innovation, there's more innovation, that treadmill that's there. The question is, at what point always does IP become a protectionist strategy in itself? That you don't induce innovation, because and the example I'll use, and it's probably controversial, it comes up quite a bit now, is pharmaceutical industry, where you get into, taking long-term patents on drugs, oftentimes broadly, that restrict other development in other areas, and you reduce innovation to the cost of the consumer. So often these conversations go very much into this producer side of this, which is what the trade issue is, of course, I recognize that. It's always been this kind of controversial thing with economics. What's the right level of protection?
Sure,
for how long? And so it's not as simple as saying, because there is a theory too that you just have open technology, in which case the innovation treadmill speeds up so fast, and then the competitive game becomes first to market. Can you be on that place to move the next treadmill to market? So it's a really interesting question. I think, like so many, I didn't give an answer either. I wanted to make sure we have 4 hands up here now, so we got a lot of other hands. But tough question. Other question? I saw somebody else either. So one I've been wondering about, this may be, we're getting near the end here, but it hasn't come up today either. But the Minneapolis Fed has been recognized for a long time as Gary Stern and Ron Feldman, I think, wrote the Too Big to Fail with regard to banking sector. We're seeing, again, a lot of, both in ag finance credit, look at it from that perspective, look at it in just size of scales of firms and ownership in agriculture and food systems. Is there such a thing, what do you see as that in an ag context, I guess, from a finance perspective? I also think on a smaller scale that we've got some very large farms out there in Minnesota now. They're typically privately held, financed by debt and equity. There's going to be some transition there, people on average age a year every 12 months kind of a thing. So how do we, what does that credit market look like in ag? Because is too big to fail a thing there, or is it, what do you think?
I mean, we are seeing, obviously, concerns from ag lenders. The longer the low ag prices continue, the more exposure, the uptick in bankruptcies and whatnot. So I think the ag sector, you all know better than I do, is under pressure. And if this continues, we'll continue being under pressure. I certainly hope too big to fail is not a thing in the ag sector. It's not a good thing for the U.S. economy if we have firms that if they fail, they bring down the rest of the U.S. economy. That's nothing to aspire to. And so, I've been of the view with my colleague Ron Feldman that the biggest banks in America, the giant banks, need a lot more capital, equity capital, to make sure that they have the buffer to withstand downturns and mistakes. But our basic capitalist system is, if a firm runs into trouble, it should be able to go through bankruptcy. And ownership may change, the operations can continue, ownership changes, and the rest of the U.S. economy is largely unaffected. So, again, I'm not wishing that on anybody, but that's where I would sense the ag sector is. Well, I think so. We're getting our nook, our hook.
Well, President Kashkari, it's
thank
been
you
a
for
delight
having me.
to
I
meet
really
you and
appreciate
visit
it.
with you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Some complicated questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.